Butcher's bill has come due, and it is very mixed news for Halloween Ends. So I'm going to get to the basics with Halloween Ends and bring in some other people like the director of Freaky and even, yes, Pearl on what are the lessons ahead for box office and streaming and the horror genre. And it's kind of good news and bad news all around. So Halloween Ends, I do think legitimately was a mild success. And I want to stress I did not like Halloween Ends, so I think it actually was a little too successful, but it clearly worked well enough that Halloween fans gave it a chance. And I don't think, despite the narrative, that, well, it would have done a lot better on streaming. No, I don't think it would have, and I'm going to explain very quickly why. Because good or bad, for the people who saw it on Peacock, they got a basic gist of what David Gordon Green was up to, and clearly many people did not like what he was up to, but many people did like it. And I think they will give it a shot in theaters and will support it in theaters. I don't think it's going to change the box office all that much because now that it's made basically slightly over 40 million, the way it usually works is you get cut in half the second weekend. So it'll probably make about 20 million next weekend and then diminishing returns. And given what they spent, which is about 30 million for the film and for marketing, it will be profitable. It won't be insanely profitable like Kills or even the first film, which did insanely well, but it'll do well enough so you can consider it a legit success. Now, again, I did not like the film, so even though my rating kind of mirrors the Rotten Tomatoes score, I actually think some of the people on Rotten Tomatoes are being too generous. And also the people that disliked it, they were just like, "Oh, it's boring. It's not what I expected. It's not what I wanted." A lot of these people don't seem to be hardcore horror fans, and they completely miss the references that were set up in the film. Good or bad, this film is filled with a lot of references. I mean, a lot of references to horror films. So if you are a horror fanatic, you're going to recognize a lot of very clever allusions to not just horror movies, but to horror novels, horror short stories. He went pretty hardcore, giving a ton of references. If that is your thing, you're going to find it in Halloween Ends. I do think you have to consider this a success, and given, frankly, to me, that it was not a very good film, I think it did fairly decent, good or bad in terms of box office. And that gets us to the question of streaming and the theatrical experience for horror films. Is this the end of the road? Well, no, because Pearl received much better scores, both from critics and from fans. And granted, it's a very small film comparatively, but it did succeed. It found its audience, it made enough money. It clearly is a box office success. So Ty West did what he set out to accomplish. And no less than Martin Scorsese praised the film. Yes, Martin Scorsese, who hates the MCU and hates what, quote, big films have done to cinema, he liked the film. He thought it was very, very enthralling. Rare bit of agreement because I do disagree with Scorsese on many things. I agree with him. I think he is correct that Pearl is a very good to great film. He was completely rhapsodic. I didn't like it as much as other critics. A lot of critics were giving it a 9 out of 10. I'm like, I don't think it's flawless, but I do think it is a great achievement. And that brings us to Freaky and the director complaining about how his film was handled with the direct to streaming nonsense and it not being given enough of a chance in theaters. Well, I got problems for him because I did see Freaky in theaters and I did not like it. I thought it had some good ideas. It was a solid premise. And the very beginning, I was getting into it. I'm like, okay, this is very clever. You're actually mixing basically Halloween with Child's Play because they basically do have a Michael Myers clone. It's this legendary killer, but full on, very early. I'm not spoiling it. He can transfer his essence. So you're like, oh, okay, interesting. And there were some really good little moments here and there and a lot of cleverness. But, and I don't want to say this, but I have to say this because I think the problem with David Gordon Green is he thinks he's this kind of master of cinema like Scorsese or Kubrick or Ong Lee or these other great all-time auteurs, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. I don't think he is. He's very talented, but he's not in that master class of just insanely great directors. He's not. But I would have to say, at a very technical level, Halloween Ends was very superior to Freaky. Even though I didn't like the soundtrack, I still kind of remember it. Whereas with Freaky, I don't really remember the soundtrack at all. The special and visual effects in Halloween Ends, sometimes they were not good, by the way, but for the most part, they made sense. But with Freaky, they just felt like, kind of okay. And Freaky felt very cheap. Like they really used very few locations. They didn't go anywhere. But Halloween Ends did give you a very good look at their version of Hanfield, which didn't make any sense, by the way, in terms of geography, but you still got a full sense that this was a real place. Not a place I want to revisit, but it felt real enough for the story, and so on and so forth. So I'd have to say, even though David Gordon Green is not as strong as Ty West, who is a much better director than both of them, he did a pretty good job in certain aspects of Halloween Ends. He, I think, failed in many other aspects, but I would not recommend Halloween Ends. But if someone asked me right now, which would you pick, Halloween Ends or Freaky? I'd have to say reluctantly, Halloween Ends is just a much better made film. Whereas Freaky does not annoy me as much as Halloween Ends. I just don't think it's as strong, unfortunately. And it had a lot of good ideas, but it just wasn't done very well. And that's the problem with Halloween Ends. A lot of ideas, but they didn't quite work out. But I have to say, enough ideas did work out that it's a much better film. And that's where I stand. So be harsh on Freaky and say it flopped, and it flopped for good reasons. I saw it in theaters. I saw it with a young audience. It wasn't a packed house, but the people who were there seemed to enjoy it. They liked it. Looking back on it now, would I prefer to have streamed it? Yeah, I think I actually would have been less annoyed because I did pay full price, and that kind of annoyed me because it just wasn't that good for the price. If it was perhaps a much lower ticket price or it was available on streaming, I'd only have to pay like $5 and I'd be like, yeah, this is more of a rent it. And I'd have to judge it by that standard. But given I saw it in theaters and I gave it a chance, it was very, very lukewarm. So unfortunately, I think Freaky flopped for good reasons. Pearl was successful for good reasons, whereas Halloween Ends, I think, is still making a little bit too much money for its quality. But again, for the audience who liked it, they are getting what they wanted.